Okay, I think I'm going to start. So first of all, thank you all for coming here, for taking the time to listen to what I'm about to present. The topic, I think, is quite a timely topic given all the latest legislative moves that are happening around the world with regards to artificial intelligence. And what we're looking at when we're looking at the EU AI Act is probably the most comprehensive legislative initiative in the world right now. So we're going to be looking today at how this initiative impacts the quality assurance process, especially for high-risk AIs. And so a bit about me before we go on into the details. I've been working in quality assurance for the past 7 years. I have a PhD in AI ethics, most of which is focused basically on whether AIs have or don't have moral capabilities, similar to what was talked in the keynote before. And I've been working at my former job in actually testing AI applications, part of it, and also been working with startups a bit in testing some quite high impact AI applications. Now, we'll be talking today about one of them, which will be presented in point 6 with testing automatic employment decision systems. There's quite a bit of things to go through. I will look at the time, might go a bit faster to some topics, a bit slower to others, depending on how time allows. And yeah, okay, so let's get started with the first topic. Why should we even care about the EU AI Act? Like, the fact that it's a big legislative project shouldn't, it's not the main reason we should care about it. We should care about it because it basically represents a sort of watershed moment when it comes down to how the path forward will look for artificial intelligence and for people that are developing and testing artificial intelligence. The act has been quite a work in process. It still is a work in process, actually. So the first draft was launched in 2021, but it had been worked before for many years by expert groups, by the EU Commission. And the whole idea is we want technological innovation. We want technology that's trustworthy, but we also need to make sure that it respects human rights, and we, of course, want innovation and growth because, our current economy is dependent on this. And the new rules are looking at artificial intelligence on layers of risk. So most applications will be low-risk applications. Very few applications will be prohibited, and a bit more will be within high risk and transparency risk. Now, when it comes down to prohibited applications, it's about biometric categorization systems, right? It's about anything that could manipulate behavior. It's about social scoring, like what's happening in China, stuff like that. So basically, anything that can be used to exploit people and exploit vulnerable people is somehow prohibited, or that could allow groups of corporations or individuals or states to get overwhelming control over others. Now, when we look at transparency risk, it's about any system that has interaction with human, that is used to detect emotions. Like, I don't know, you might have, lately you have these TVs with ads on it. Now imagine there's a camera on that, and the camera checks, how do you feel about this ad? And depending on the people there, can create profiles and can show ads based on who is around the TV. Now, things like this are transparency risk, for example. And anything else that does not fall within these two and the high risk category is minimal or no risk. Now, high risk, there are a few categories of what sort of softwares fall into this. So it's about anything that has to do with justice and the democratic process. It's about what will be the case study app, basically employee worker management softwares, even if it is, for example, I don't know, like going through somebody's CV and deciding if you are going to interview that person or not, is very likely to fall under the EU-AI Act in the future. So this automatic decision system or filtering systems need to be highly explainable, and any person needs to be able to go back and say, hey, why are you making this decision? Theoretically, even nowadays, given GDPR, companies that do any sort of automatic screening or any sort of decisions that impact the fundamental rights of a person can actually be, the companies can be liable for huge sums of money if they do not provide explanations post hoc based on demand. We have education, we have law enforcement, and we have anything that is an essential private or public service. So this can be anything that has to do with medicine, this can be anything that has to do with national security, etc. So whatever you think can be essential, like local transport, access to, for example, what happened in the Netherlands with access to social services, would all fall under high-risk AI. Now, the central to this high-risk concept is that the apps need to affect people's life in a significant way. So even if there are categories that I did not mention right now, or if they're not mentioned within the act, if you think that they affect people's life in a significant way, you should rather do the whole process of assuring it as per the act, and later we'll see exactly why. Now, what I think the act mainly does is it sets a sort of new high bar for system quality. Like we already have, like ISO standards for AI software and various other standards by a variety of organizations, but now these standards become legally binding. And well, the reality of why we should care about this whole act is not out of the naivety that companies are good actors and want all the good to happen in the world. No, it's because your stockholder will suffer if you do not follow this, and then they will be mad because they're losing money. That's basically the reality of our world. So the EU goes very practical and says, okay, if you do any sort of prohibited AI, you will pay up to 40 million euros or 7% of your turnover. So turnover is what the company makes at a global level in a year. And it is whichever is higher. And as we go down the list, it's always whatever is higher for the various non-compliances that are there. So even if you do the analysis, but you misrepresent some information, intentional or not, you might still have to pay up to 1% of your turnover. So there's an actual impact if we don't follow this. Now, since the whole talk is about quality assurance, we need to look at the testers, which are one of the main actors within the quality assurance process. And I think in the evolving landscape where the EU AI Act sets a new level for quality assurance, we also need testers to raise to a new level. And that means they need to be multifaceted. So they need to understand the ethical considerations of the application, they need to understand the legal consideration, and as before, they need to understand the technical considerations, business considerations, etc. It's pivotal, I think, that testers become risk analysts. And why I'm saying risk analyst is when we're testing any sort of application, we're trying to do the quality assurance of the application. What we are actually trying to determine is how risky is it to use this application. It's not just, does this feature work? It's how likely is it that we will meet a problem within the use of the application. So I think this is one of the main takeaways when we think about testing under the EU AI Act. Quality assurance and testing is about risk management. Okay, now, what are the key requirements for the EU AI Act? I bundled this up in 6 groups. One is risk management and data governance. So risk management, we need to analyze the risk, we need to identify the risks, we need to mitigate the risk, etc. And these risks have to do with health, have to do with safety, have to do with ethics, fundamental human rights, discriminations, all of the above, and anything else you might think is important. Now, since we're talking about AI, we cannot dissociate risk from data. That's why I bundled these two together. Like most of the risks that an AI is going to generate will be dependent on the data that we feed it one way or another. So we need to be particularly careful when we do, the data quality assessments. Of course, like any system needs to be technically robust. So it needs to be resilient to, how should I frame it in a good way? Like people might generate harmful behavior willingly or unwillingly, especially when it comes down to, I think generative AI is one of the best examples for this. You're writing a blog post and you're automating the process. You don't know what the AI is going to write. It might be harmful for some people. So another one is, of course, cybersecurity. The system will be using a lot of data, will be often stocking data. So it's a major risk for privacy. Testing and validation, as always, all systems need to be tested, need to be validated as the requirements. Transparency, this is one of the key words about the EU AI Act. The whole idea of this act is to make everybody aware of what's going on with your AI system. So if your AI system is high risk, basically, if any government official or user wishes to know what's going on with your app, they should be able to read it in a documentation. They should know all the user stories you've put in there, like all the requirements, how each requirement was tested, and who was responsible for each step in the decision-making process. So it's a very comprehensive documentation requirement from providers and also users. Like if you're a user of an app of an AI app and you create an app with that app and make it available, you have all the same obligations as the provider. So basically to take the data, explain how you modified whatever was modified, and so forward. And you need to do all the QA as well to make sure that you know what the provider said, you as user confirmed that, well, it's okay, and now you can give it to secondary users. Human oversight, in the keynote this was mentioned as well, AI is not morally responsible, at least not yet. So the only person that's responsible for anything the AI does is the human. That's in control of the system, or has to at least be somehow in control of the system. Any human needs to be able to intervene if they have the right to intervene, and need to be able to stop the system, need to be able to change the decision of the system. And once the system is deployed, since AI is very sensitive to changes in the real world, you need to constantly be tracking it. And of course, document the tracking. Okay, so that's a lot of requirements right now. How do we assure for these requirements? The EU does not tell you within the Act that you should use this method or this other method for quality assurance. However, I'm going to present a few methods that I personally believe, given the requirements of the EU AI Act, need to be implemented. These methods are not comprehensive. They can change it from application to application. It's just, I think, this is a minimal requirement within the assurance process that, if you tick these boxes, you're quite likely to be able to cover the requests from the EU AI Act. The first method is about consistent, so you need a method that allows you to check for consistent performance and compliance. And you can choose manual, automated, you can choose when you do the test route, the software development life cycles, but it's important that we assure that the system performs consistently based on its intended purpose. You need to test in the real world. Any AI system's behavior is different when exposed to real world context than when exposed to your data, because between when you took the data to when you launch the system, you can already have some data drift. So you need to expose it to the real world. You also will never be able to, consider everything, especially for these high-risk systems. So you can only see what's happening once it's in the real world. Continuous testing, we need to test from the moment we started thinking about the project. We need to put a quality assurance mindset into the whole development pipeline. Clear metrics, of course, we need to know what we are assuring against. These metrics can be driven by legislation. They can also be driven by internal or client company requirements, etc. And of course, we have the thresholds that need to be clear. We need to consider the vulnerable groups. So you cannot have, I think, any sort of documentation that will be EU AI Act aligned if you do not have a chapter about this app is not biased towards various vulnerable groups. And finally, adversarial testing. You need to hit it hard, because once it's out there, there will be somebody that will try to jailbreak your system somehow. So rather you try to jailbreak it first and see what happens. Now, how is this practiced? So I'm thinking, let's look at 2 use cases a bit, go through them quick, like what would this mean? So we can look at medical diagnostic AI, and we can look at autonomous driving. So in diagnostics, we're interested, when it comes down to performance and compliance, we wanted to do the right diagnostic for a diverse set of patients, and it needs to be GDPR and fundamental rights compliant. Now, since medicine, there are going to be already a lot of legislation of what this means. So we need to make sure we're following all that legislation when we're considering performance. For autonomous driving, it's not only about, it can drive consistently okay on the road, it doesn't cause accidents. We also would like to make sure that if there's a red light, it doesn't cross the red light. It doesn't matter if crossing it doesn't cause accidents. We have a regulation that needs to be followed. So real-world testing for the medical diagnostic thing is, it needs to work side by side by doctors without having any impact while you're doing the testing. So it's like a patient comes to the doctor, they fill out whatever form, or the doctor does whatever analysis, they feed it to the system generates a result, but the results should not be shown to the doctor. The doctor should make their own diagnostics, and post hoc, somebody checks that the diagnostics matched or didn't, and who performed better. Then on autonomous driving, we've already seen this in the news. You have somebody sitting behind the wheel and waiting to touch it if something goes wrong. Testing from early stages to later stages is different. So in early stages, for example, it's about model accuracy, sensor accuracy, depending on use case. And later on, it can become about how the various systems interact. And then how does this interaction change in a real-world environment. Metrics, use case dependent. It can be reaction time in the case of cars, how well it's keeping its lane, how fast does it brake, and how much distance does it brake. While for diagnostic can be false positive, false negative, how much time does it need to do all these things. And the groups here are just some example for the 2 use cases. Generally, children, elderly are going to be a group. Generally, people with different cognitive capabilities might be a group. And in adversarial testing for cars, we've seen this already often in news. Like, for example, somebody took a cone, put it on a Waymo car, and the Waymo car could not move anymore because it thought it's in a construction site. Okay, they could have done this at Google as well and put the cone themselves, but a kid got bored and did it and blocked their car for a day or so. So once things are out in the real world, somebody, maybe just for fun, will go like, okay, let's mess this up, see what happens. In this whole process, it's not enough that you go and say, okay, so I've tested this and trust me, everything is fine. There will be another body that checks that everything you said is actually what you said. And that's the whole point of this conformity assessment. So we've been talking before, all the paperwork that needs to be done, all the actual work that needs to be done to make the paperwork. And this whole goes in like 4 different types of documentation. That's at least how I'm structuring it right now. So everything I'm saying, there's no precise implementation guidelines for the app for now, since it's not actual legislation, it's a legislation proposal. What I've done is based on our best intuitions on how to do this. So I'm not saying this is a surefire thing that you need to have these types of documentation. I'm thinking, based at least on my knowledge, these types of documentation cover a lot of what is demanded. So one is technical doc review, which needs to be a comprehensive examination of the AI's technical documentation, and it should have everything about the system. Like everything about the business context, everything about the system needs to be there. You need to have a system test and analysis documentation. This is all the tests that you've run and why you've run them. A risk assessment, which is basically, so we've done all this testing and we know all of these things about the system and we know all of these things about the real world. This is what we've tested. This is what we have not tested yet. These are the risks that we know of. These are the risks that we think could still happen, even though we have not confirmed that they can happen. And then, of course, there are unknown unknowns, which cannot be covered there. But I also have quality assurance checks. So what do I mean by this? I didn't find a better way to say it. Maybe quality assurance governance would have been a better way of putting this, but it's basically, you need to have a document that explains how you have done the quality assurance and the auditing throughout the whole process of the development and during the deployment and so on. So for this, we need to have like an internal governance framework documented somewhere. This basically covers the organizational structure and the responsibility that everybody within the structure has. So we need to know who is this person responsible for that, what are the limits of their responsibilities, and who makes the decisions for what, etc. We also need to have a clear accountability mechanism that is documented. So, okay, you are responsible for this, who holds you accountable? So there should always be somehow a cross accountability. Like even if somebody is the decision maker, there should be somebody that can hold the decision maker accountable within the process. So for this, it can often be a sort of like ethics committee that has the responsibility, or a legal committee. It depends on, I don't know, what sort of organization you are. You might use different names for the same thing. Compliance and monitoring mechanisms. So we have the system that is being developed, and we need to show that we are continuously monitoring it so that it's compliant with all the standards. And with the ethics policies, as I was saying before, not only do we need to have an ethics organization or legal organization that does the same thing, we need to have it written, these are our ethical guidelines, this is who checks for the ethical guidelines, and this is who makes sure that these guidelines are also implemented. So, another way, I was talking at the beginning, there are 4 types of reports. What I found is, looking through various papers, is that some people recommend another structured reports, which is you have a technical documentation where you basically put everything about the system. You have a risk management documentation where you also envelop the QA process, and then you have a compliance report which has 2 parts. So basically, a compliance report where you're doing it, where you say, so we followed all the steps, and then there is an auditor that will also cover all of this. Okay, now the last point before we get to the case study would be the post-deployment monitoring. So the system is live. What do we do now? Well, actually, before the system is live, we should have a plan. So we should have clear objectives defined. So what do we want to monitor? How are we going to continuously be doing the monitoring? How are we going to address risks or problems as they come in? And what are the minimal performance standards, which, if not fulfilled, we take the system offline? We need to have a clear understanding of the stakeholders involved. So this is users, this is internal company decision makers, this is any regulatory body. All of these, we need to have an understanding of them, and they need to have a way of contacting us with any sort of problem that might happen. And of course, all of this post-development monitoring will require resources, so we need to have a plan in place for that. The plan also needs to be transparent so that people can hold us accountable for, are we following our plan or not. Now, we have a few metrics. We have performance metrics. These are generally internal things. Like we have stated, these are the metrics upon which we base the quality of our system. Then you have the user feedback, where the user comes to you and says, hey, well, your system might meet all your metrics, but it's still a problem. And here is why. So we need to be able to analyze user feedback and make decisions based on user feedback. Incident reporting is, well, first of all, maybe we discover a problem during the post-deployment monitoring. We need to be able to report any problem that we discover somewhere, and we need to be able to act on the problem as stated before. Our users need to be able to do the same thing, and any sort of other authority needs to have a way to, I don't know, if the EU Act will be implemented at the national level, and it will have like a governmental body and variety of auditors. So an auditor needs to be able to make an incident report, a governmental body needs to be able to make an incident report, a user needs to be able to do it, and of course, we need to be able to do this as well. Finally, it's the compliance auditing. We will be getting audited before deployment and after deployment, most likely. It's not clear. The frequency of the auditings, they're not stated yet. All the actual implementation policies of the Act are blurry for now because the Act is not legally enforceable yet, but for sure, standards will be developed for this later on. Okay, so that was a lot of theory about you need this and you need that. From that, now, how did we use it? So at a company that I worked for had the following problem. So then it grew exponentially, in a few years. It basically doubled its workforce. It went from 9 to 10,000 people to 18 to 20,000 people in about 3 years, something like that. It had a lot of clients, a lot of client demand. It had quite a significant bench already, and it was struggling to put the right people on the right project. Because the way it worked before was for a much smaller organization. They were scaling so rapidly that the whole talent allocation just could not keep up with this. So they needed some algorithms. And the main thing was there were no consistent standards. We'll get back to that as the challenges. So what the HR came basically to us and said, okay, so we have this talent allocation and processing team. They need to put the right candidate on the right job, and they need to know when the right candidate might appear. For now, it's being done manually, too much effort, we cannot keep up, we cannot hire and train people fast enough to do this, and we are reaching a bottleneck. Right now, it's not a major problem, but we can see in the future that it will impact our attrition rates, and it will impact our churn rates. So we have two things that we want, right? We have something that is called an express checkout. Basically, the talent allocation team gets, these are your top candidates for this job, and an ETA, we estimate that you're going to have a candidate for this job in this amount of time. Now, the challenges for the project is, first of all, we have tribal knowledge. What I mean by this is, one HR does the allocation in one way, another HR does it in another way. Specific industries, because the company had verticals and horizontals. So a horizontal, was applying people for the various verticals within the company, and everything functioned differently. So there was one logic for how the horizontals were doing the allocation, another logic for how the verticals were doing the allocation. Within each vertical, there was sub-segments on how the allocation should be done. So it was a nightmare just, figuring out the logic. And figuring out the logic that makes sense for a bigger system, not just, for your small department. For that, we said, okay, we interview everybody, we document the interviews. So the interviews were recorded, and both video, and we had the text for it because the text is easier to search for auditors and so on. And we audited the decisions that were made historically, and we went through them and discussed. So we figured out more or less what is the normal decisions that were made. That was easy then to follow. And then we had decisions that were deviating from normality. We had discussion, documented why those decisions were made, so that we can later transform them into requirements. Data scoping. Big problem with the data here, most of it should actually be encrypted, and it should be anonymized because it's very sensitive data that we're using. So we have, for example, the history of the performance of that person. Now, you don't really want somebody to get a hand on, this is how you've performed for the past 7 years at this job. You also don't want to get a hand, very interesting. People could say if they preferred remote or if they didn't prefer to work remotely. Now, at first sight, this seems to be a no-brainer, that's not a problem. Actually, if you looked at the data, just by knowing that somebody prefers to be remote, you could easily discriminate based on gender, especially in like countries like India, and based on socioeconomic status. Often people that were older and had more powers within the company would be used to not working remote, so they would check, I don't really care. And younger people would often check, I prefer to work remotely. So we had to actually get rid of that data point, for example, because rather have a discussion with the person that says, I don't want to work on site, than discriminate from the get-go. Also, in this sort of cases, especially now, companies might still be willing to say, you can still work remote, it's not a problem, or we can figure out a hybrid method. So all this data quality checks, and of course, thinking what data should be there and what sort of gaps we have in data needed to be considered. Oh yeah, sorry. So after that we had, sorry for the titles, I messed up there. After that we had the black box problem, right? The algorithm, you cannot really look into it most of the time. However, GDPR and EU AI Act and a law from New York demanded, at least in this, because the company was global, so it was in Europe, it was in the US, in New York as well. And it demanded that, well, you need to explain why you made your decision. You cannot just put somebody on a job and go like, this is your job. No, there needs to be a clear explanation of why they should go on that job, why they should accept your allocation offer, so on and so forth. So, big challenge with actually coming up with an explainable model, because very well-performing models, which are ensemble models, they are not really explainable. So we need to figure out a few tricks for that. I'm not an expert in AI, but basically what was used was line and shape. Don't ask me questions about this. This is what the data scientists decided to use. Personally, I don't know what's going on with those two methods. Then monitoring, we set up some dashboards, we automated some regression tests, and we were sampling the tests so that we can go into auditing every now and then of the system. And finally, in testing, testers right now, most of them do not know data science. Data scientists and machine learning engineers don't care about testing because data science is not your standard software development, so why even test, We just have our test data and we have our training data, and that's it for about 90% of the projects that I've seen until now. Even requirements, like if you're in a machine learning project and you really have all the requirements written down, that's gold. In most cases, somebody comes and says, I just want this automated, and you go, okay, at least that's how many companies experiment right now with AI. Now, for the testing approach, what we did was we went basically through these 5 steps. We were like, okay, we're going to do some manual processing. We're going to look at model evaluation and model explainability evaluation, user acceptance testing, and then we're going to get some audits done, and then we're going to monitor the whole thing. So here we want to codify the logic. We want to make sure that all capabilities can be audited. And what I was saying before, you go through all the historic decisions, you try to recreate it, you try to determine what are edge cases, you're creating a variety of scenarios, and you're trying to generate test coverage based on those scenarios, especially those that are likely to violate some constraints that you think would be really good to have. And we want to also be able to automate as much as possible, because once you've deployed the system, it's much easier to do automated testing than manual testing. We need to evaluate the models. Now, evaluating the models was hectic. We needed to generate synthetic data quite a lot. We needed to generate, those edge cases often, because some of the data was quite old. The data structures had changed, so we couldn't really fully use all the data. So we had to see what are the patterns from the older data versus the patterns from the newer data, and we had to, fill in the gaps. We need to see the performance of the model, both how long does it take to make a decision and how accurate is the decision. And we need this to be robust, what I was saying, so we need to do serial testing. So for example, one of the things was our company is expanding in a new geography. So we're going to put in this new country in. It doesn't even have to exist. You can just put blah, blah, blah country and see what happens there. How does the country affect the performance? And often you see that on a country level, the AI might decide to skew the data because it's used to a certain pattern for, for Germany versus another pattern for Romania, given historical data. For the UAT, we had the actual talent management team, talent allocation team, check out everything that we were doing. They were doing a scenario-based testing. So basically, they would take, they would take some data from production, let's say, and they would go like, okay, I'm going to pretend that this is somebody, that we want to test. They would input here are the data of this user. Can you allocate it to a demand? And then they would take data from production to make a demand. Now, in this case, since it was done by the talent management team, with nobody having access to it, it can be debatably said that it's okay. Ideally, you need to use anonymized data, encrypted data, so on. But all of these steps actually create problems along the way to actually check that the system works. So at one point, you do need to shoot it with some real data and see what's going on. And they also have to check that the explanation of the system makes sense, because at the end of the day, if somebody comes back and says, hey, why did you recommend me this project? it's going to be the talent allocation team that needs to explain to them, this is why we recommended you the project. Oh, and of course, here, very important, they can always revert. Like if the system says A should go on project X, they can say no, project X should have person B or whatever. Person A does not like to work in these sort of projects, so they should be able to interact with the system. We were testing for all these things. Now, for the pre-deployment audits, we had, until this point, the system was already tested quite a bit. It had gone through the UAT, but now we need somebody that was not really involved in the development of the project to be able to read through all the documentation that we have and to confirm that things are the way we say they are. So they should be able to play with the system and go like, yeah, the requirements are what you say they are. They seem to be, the system seems to have been developed as per the requirements. The test results are what you say they are. We've also tested it. We can confirm this. We can understand what the model explains. Like if they're not subject matter experts, by talking to subject matter experts and getting them terminology explained and logic explained, they should be able to deduce that, yeah, it makes sense. And here it would be good to do some security testing, like some hardcore security testing. And finally, this is once the system is out in the wild, we're checking again that all the metrics outside, they are what they're supposed to be. We are doing regular compliance reviews, and we're tracking how easy it is to actually do rollback. So that's one of the things, like in machine learning, you have a model, then you deploy a new version of the model, but happens that, well, actually the new version performed really well on the test data, but now that's in the wild, it's not performing as well as we expected it. So we need to be able to roll back to the previous version, which was doing a bit better. Okay, so to wrap this up, I think there are a few key takeaways. So QA are our gatekeeper basically for system reliability, for transparency, for compliance, and that means that QA changes, as I said before. It's about risk management, it's about ethical safeguarding, legal safeguarding, and technical safeguarding. Testers need to expand their oversight in this sort of projects throughout the whole machine learning life cycle. So that means from ideation all the way into post-deployment. It's important that testers become not necessarily experts, but versed in machine learning and data science. What we did in our case, we were having sort of collab teams. So we had a tester working with the data scientist, one didn't know testing, one didn't know data science, but somehow together they knew both things that were needed and could do the task of assuring the quality. We want to make sure that testing is done continuous and that governance is a continuous priority in this case. So we're constantly going to check for data drift once something is out in the open. Testing is going to be done while the system is also in production, and we need to ensure that algorithms interact the way we expect them with the real world. And finally, I think, as I've said before, transparency is somehow the key word of the EU AI Act, and this and oversight would be a second thing that is necessary and can only be done once you have transparency. So transparency basically allows humans to actually be in control of the machine and to be able to be responsible for its actions, which is what we need to do. Okay, thank you very much. And if you have questions, free to go. Yes.
You presented the needs of being compliant, of getting, and also of putting up incident management.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you have the EU will set up more rules or have a contact person. How do I keep informed? Is the EU newsletter?
Yeah, so for now, if you want to be up to date on these things, there are various working groups for AI ethics. I think one is Holistic Algorithm called. There is For Humanity, another group. So basically, they are all on LinkedIn, actually, their pages. And what they do is they inform everybody who's interested. These are the latest discussions in the parliament, in the commission, and I don't know where about these sort of legislations. They don't only follow EU legislation, they also follow what's happening in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, and the US, and so on. So they can be helpful. There are many, many groups, but I would not say that the EU is struggling very hard to make it easily accessible for you to get this information. In the sense, like, they have their own website and everything, but there's so much going on there. There's so many legislative initiatives that going through their website and finding everything that you need is a hassle. So.
I have a second question. You presented the bias, or rather the indirect discrimination of young people because they want to work remotely.
Yeah.
How do I detect this kind of indirect effects, or how do I detect bias in a general way?
Yeah, so there are some tools that already look at somehow data correlations and how they impact decisions. So for example, I'm missing the name of the tool now, but Google has a very cool one with a nice dashboard. Basically, you put your data and it will show for these sort of jobs, you have a high correlation from this factor. And this factor can be remote working, like if it's ticked or not. And then you can say, well, it seems that remote working has a huge impact. Now let's see to what does remote working correlate, that you do the second step. So you're not looking at the output variable anymore, you're looking at the other input variables. Mm-hmm. And you might find it correlates to gender, it correlates to age, it correlates to I don't know what. And then you go, now that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Because by using this variable, I'm actually using the other two variables, and I don't want to use that when I'm making decisions.
So you're using one AI to see if the other AI model is working as it's supposed or as you want it to?
That can also be done, but in this case, you're just using basic statistics to generate correlation graphs. But for example, in some use cases, like large language model use cases, you do use one model to check the other. And the model tells you, we think there might be some problems here, and then a human needs to check. And for example, if you have large data sets, then you might have, I don't know, some poisonous data there. It can be very hard to detect if the poisonous data was injected smartly. So there you will need an AI that might be black box to help orient you. But you still need to look then yourself at the data and go like, yeah, this is poisonous, and you might still miss the data. But these are also things like, so for example, the EU Act will not tell you, don't use these methods when you're doing your data quality assessment, because for some data structures, you just cannot do it another way. It just goes like, be transparent about the method you've used, explain the limitations of the method you've used, and if you've done these things correctly, you're safe.
So, but what if I want to use this information? So maybe the Act says I cannot or I'm not allowed to use, I don't know, age for things, but I want to use it, right? So the person who is sitting there looking at an applicant is looking if this applicant is, I don't know, 65 or 62, or if he's 27. So I cannot do this because it's not correct somehow. But actually, we are doing this in our process, right?
That-
We as humans
That's
are
true.
doing it.
That's true. The thing is, the person's CV can go through the app. The app is not allowed to remove the person, but once the person's in front of you, you can still make the decision. I actually don't want to go on with that person. Or once you have the CV in front of you, you as a human can still make that. The important thing is that you don't have a society or any sort of structure that is deterministically discriminant. So basically, let's imagine this sort of our world as doors through which you can go through. And if you're discriminated against, some doors disappear. Now, the idea is that if you have a system that automatically makes doors disappear, some people may end up without any doors and nobody will even know that these sort of people exist because the systems always filter them out. So if the person comes in front of you, there's at least a human awareness of, this is going on.
Yeah, but still, if this is a prerequisite for that job,
Yeah.
that the person that is there is, I don't know, let's say a junior developer or something.
Yeah.
So I cannot give that job to someone who is like 10 years experience, or I do not want to. So that I don't want to see these people because that's helping me my
You
process.
don't need AI for that, you just filter.
Yeah, sure, but yeah, that's what. But
Yeah,
I
but you can
cannot
do the
that
filter
by
manually.
using AI. So when I want to use AI to improve that process, to make that process faster, I'm not allowed to.
No.
But I can
So
filter it from.
you
You
can
just do not put the CVs in the system.
exactly. Yeah. So you
Yeah.
go like
Alright.
make an app. You first filter, show all CVs below this age, because as somebody, when people apply, you do see that, and you're allowed to see that. Like they sign GDPR and everything, and then you can have access to that data. You filter the age, or you filter for whatever shape or form you want to be biased on, but it has to be your choice and your moral responsibility and legal responsibility for the discrimination that you do. Not all discrimination is bad discrimination, even though it has a negative connotation to it. So then you've done the filtering yourself, and the AI processes filtered data, and it goes, given the data set, go. Here is what we recommend.
But you'd still potentially follow other regulations, right? So you gotta be smart about this. Like, you're not gonna fall foul of this regulation, but there are other, human, regulation, human resource regulations that you might fall foul of. So you better be aware of this.
Yeah.
Or be prepared to pay fines. It's all good.
Like, these regulations are just on the system or not on the human behavior, It's like, if the system is fine, doesn't mean you cannot be mean, or you cannot still fuck somebody over. You can do that. And you're allowed to, as long as it's a human that does it, And then you can be legally liable, because the system cannot be legally liable.
It depends on what you're doing or whether you are allowed to do it.
Well,
If it's firing everybody around, it's not allowed.
we inform you today, 80% of you are fired. Goodbye.
So do you know about any more concrete directions, guidance by these regulators? Or do you think it will stay on this high-level requirements level, and then it's up to everyone user? So I just think about other safety standards that probably say for testing these techniques are mandatory and these are highly recommended, something like this.
The Act does not have this right now. Once it becomes law, it has to have it. You cannot have a law that is in function without applicability standards. So you need to know this is how you implement it. And otherwise, if there's no this is how you implement it, the law cannot be applied, and nobody can confirm that you've applied the law.
So the ISO group is working hard on something?
Well, actually, this has to come from a national level in the EU. So the EU AI Act will say this is the act, and then each country has a duty to implement it through legislation within a specific time frame. Now, the EU will have some recommendations on how to implement this, probably. They're not out yet, because for now, there's not even a final decision on the act. It's just the draft is in a very quite complete form right now. And as any provider or user, we sort of need to imagine what the obligations might be. But I still think, if you're doing a system right now that you want to still be on the market in some way or form in 5 years, and it's a high-risk system, I mean, just by documenting the lot, you are going to help yourself for sure once this legislation kicks in.
So what is the timeline? When will it be
Theoretically,
required?
theoretically, this year it was once stated that there would be a final vote on it, but there's still a lot of lobbying going on. So at one point they wanted to make fundamental models a high-risk AI thing. Now there was so much lobbying about this that it's a transparency risk, it's not a high risk. Okay. There are other lobbies that are actively on this, like my system shouldn't be high risk, or people that want specific systems to be high risk from NGOs and so on. Hopefully this year we get a final draft and a final vote. For what I think I remember, don't quote me on this, but I think I remember that the Commission at least has voted that the current draft, they're fine with it. The Parliament needs to vote on it now, and then implementation procedures need to be defined.
Theoretically, Germany has 1 year, but we know that they can also take 5 years.
Yeah.
They pay the fee.
Okay, thank you very much for listening.